Congress in the 11th District, and we welcome you. Our process is very simple, and the first thing I'd like to do is have each member of the panel introduce themselves, and we'll give you some time, and then we will start asking some questions.
Sure.
We'll start off with
Jack Stafer. Harry Abrams. Good morning.
Morning. Pass the chair.
Trenton Adams.
And Bill Durrell. Good morning, Bob.
And we have one gentleman that's not able to make it today. The video process will be utilized on the CCRP website, and we will do everything to prevent anyone from obtaining the video without proper use or request. There are numerous ways, of course, that videos can be obtained regardless of the best attempts to secure it, but we wanted you to know that we are videotaping this, and it will only be placed on the the CCRP website, just like all the others. The vetting process is meant to allow members of the party and the community to be able to understand the positions, views, and beliefs of the issues and questions held by those who wish to be elected as a representative of the people. Primarily, that is the introduction of our process. We have a group of 35 questions that we're going to be asking that pertain specifically to what I placed in the invitation letter. Physical responsibility, Constitution, and specific questions designed just for congressional candidates, let's put it that way. What I'd like to do is give you a minute to introduce yourself on the video, and then we will start our questioning.
Thank you. First of all, I very much appreciate the opportunity to be with you all, and through the video, so many additional voters and concerned citizens here in Cherokee County. My name is Bob Barr, and I live in Cobb County, but am a candidate for the 11th District, which, as we all know, is Cherokee, Bartow, part of Cobb, and a little bit of Buckhead, and even a little bit of Sandy Springs thrown in for good measure. The election will be May 20th. No Democrat has qualified for the race, which reflects the very heavy Republican nature of the district, which is a good fit for all of us in this room, including myself. I have, as you all know, and as probably all of the voters out there know, served previously in the Congress from what was then the 7th District for 8 years on the Judiciary and the Government Reform and Oversight and Financial Services Committee. I had the honor of serving as one of the impeachment managers, which impeached Bill Clinton and then prosecuted him in the Senate. Also had the honor of serving at a time when our Republican majority in the House actually meant something. We balanced the budget, we cut taxes, we reformed welfare, we protected our Second Amendment rights. And I am asking the voters of the 11th District to allow me once again to do those things that I did before, and that is to work to balance the budget, cut government power, cut the cost of government, and protect our fundamental rights. So thank you all for having me here.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate that. What we'd like to do now, you're going to be taking care of the timekeeper, the timing. Who's taking care of that?
Well, I
Okay.
can just
2
give
minutes for
and
the
then-
answers
or you want me
and
to go
questions.
like-
So I'd like to start with the first question and with an answer. Now, you don't have to take 2 minutes to answer a question if you want to just say yes or no or something. That's perfect. We're just going to give you 2 minutes to answer
Okay.
questions, just so you're aware. Go ahead, Jack.
Bob, are you currently a member of your local Republican Party? And how do you see your involvement going forward, regardless of the outcome of this election?
I intend to remain a very active and concerned Republican voter and citizen in the 11th District. I'm a member of all 4 of the county Republican parties that comprise the 7th District. I'm a member of the Republican Foundation, the Republican Party of Georgia Foundation, and I intend to remain very active at the local level, in addition to helping the state party and the district party move our agenda of conservative government forward.
Bob, do you support right-to-work legislation?
I believe that it's one of the factors that has really kept Georgia's economy over the years strong is the fact that we are a right-to-work state, and there are no major legal impediments to companies hiring individuals without being forced to accept only union membership. So I think that's important to continue that, not just here in Georgia, but across the country.
Should there be limits on the amount of money businesses and corporations can contribute to political campaigns?
I don't think that there ought to be any limits on the amount that an individual can contribute to a political campaign. To me, I agree with what the Supreme Court has said in several decisions over the decades, and that is contributions to a political candidate are a form of free speech. Yet, unfortunately, on the other hand, the Supreme Court has on a number of occasions placed limits on those. I do not believe that as far as an individual is concerned, there ought to be a limit on the amount of money that they contribute to a candidate. I do believe in transparency. I do believe in full, open, and timely reporting of those. With regard to corporations, corporations under current federal law, which I think is sound, largely thanks to the Citizens United decision of just a few years ago, corporations can contribute to advocating for in the political process. They cannot contribute directly to candidates in federal elections, and I see no need to change that. I do, though, strongly believe in support for the Citizens United decision, which removed the inappropriate barrier to corporations and political action committees contributing to advocate for elections and for positions during the election cycles.
Bob, what unique qualities do you have that are important for a House member to possess?
First and foremost, Bill, I have a deep and abiding love for this country that has been reflected in my professional career, whether it's working for the Central Intelligence Agency for a number of years, whether it was serving as President Reagan's United States Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia, or as reflected in my service previously for 8 years in the House of Representatives from the 7th District of Georgia. So I take a backseat to no citizen of this district with regard to my love for this country and the very strong actual record of what I have done to move that love for this country and my strong belief in the Constitution forward. Many candidates, probably all candidates, Bill, will talk about what they would like to do, what they intend to do, what they will do if they're elected to the Congress. I not only say that, but I also have a record of actually having done those things that we believe in when I served previously in the Congress. People know where Bob Barr stands. They know I've always been front and center with the Constitution, which to me is more important than any other public policy or political party or policy in this country. The Constitution is where I stand, and that will not change.
Thank you.
Excuse me. Do you believe it's the government's job to ensure all persons have access to health care regardless of the ability to pay?
Absolutely not. That is the right of the individual. That is the right of the doctors to ensure an individual's proper level of health care. And many of the problems that we've seen, which were cited as justification for Obamacare, are actually the result of government attempts to interfere in that process in the first place. What we need to be doing is removing those barriers to a full, open, and free provision of medical care and medical attention. Puts the emphasis once again on the patient and the doctor and frees up the individual to be able to take their insurance policy wherever they go. It's theirs, they're paying for it, and they ought to have that portability. We ought to remove the barriers to insurance companies being able to offer policies anywhere in the country that they wish. Yet instead, what we have over the last 3 years, now more than 3 years, is this one-size-fits-all, very heavy-handed federal program that dictates everything from what doctor you will go to how much you pay for it. That's the exact 180-degree turn from where we ought to be going. It is not the government's job to guarantee health care. It is the individual's responsibility to obtain it and make sure that it works.
Thank you. I'm going to back up here real quick. Based on your understanding of the U.S. Constitution, Bob, what do you believe the role is of the member of the House of Representatives?
A member of the House of Representatives is a very sacred position. It is enshrined in our Constitution. And I believe that the role of a member of Congress, and I practiced this when I served previously in the Congress, is to represent the interests of his or her constituents consistent with the Constitution of the United States.
Thank you. Harry?
What is your position on term limits?
I supported term limits previously when I was in the House, supported and spoke in support of and voted for a term limit amendment. That was part of the Contract with America, the platform on which I was partially elected back in 1994, and I continue to support term limits.
Thank you.
What type of federal gun control laws would you support?
I support no additional federal gun controls, and I do support a federal law that would provide for a national right to carry. To me, it's entirely inconsistent if you take the Heller and McDonald decisions by the Supreme Court in 2008 and 2010 respectively, which very clearly established once and for all, hopefully, that the right to carry, the right to possess a firearm is a fundamental individual right that predates the Constitution. And yet, on the other hand, the courts continue to allow states to enact and maintain barriers to a person exercising that right. So I think we need to get rid of those barriers. If a person is a citizen of this United States and has, in fact, that individual fundamental human right as reflected in our Second Amendment to keep and bear arms, then they ought to be able to exercise that across state lines. So that is one piece of legislation that I have supported in the past and believe that we must continue to press for.
What does the 10th Amendment mean to you?
10th Amendment is perhaps one of the least understood, least cited of all of our Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments by the courts, yet it is perhaps the most fundamentally important because it very clearly stands for the proposition that our Constitution is not intended to be a comprehensive list of rights that the people enjoy, but is intended only to codify those relatively few powers that are within the breast of the federal government. It places certain very important limits on what states, for example, can do to limit individual rights. And the 10th Amendment says that everything else, other than those enumerated specific powers in the Constitution, belong to the people of the states. I mean, that is of fundamental importance, yet you look at every year the many, many dozens of Supreme Court decisions that come out. Very rarely will you ever see one that actually discusses and bases a decision in whole or in part on the 10th Amendment. It ought to be the other way around. That ought to be the one that is cited more often than any other.
Do you believe that states have the right to nullify unconstitutional federal laws?
Within bounds they do, Jack. It's a very important discussion. There are certainly things that states ought to be doing and should be doing, such as taking a stand against Obamacare. That falls within sort of the broad concept of nullification. So states do have that, not just a right, but an obligation to that. If, in fact, the federal government has passed a law that is not constitutional and therefore is not subject to the full faith and credit or the supremacy clause of the Constitution, then states have an obligation to stand up to it and nullify it. There are limits on that, obviously. A state cannot nullify a federal law that clearly is within the bounds of the Constitution, that clearly comports with one of the amendments, such as the 14th Amendment, for example. But given those limits, yes, I do think it's not only, as I say, a right that states have, but an obligation to stand up to the federal government through that process.
Are there any conditions under which you would advocate either raising existing taxes or implementing new taxes?
No. What I plan to do is what I did before when I served in the Congress, and is more important now than it was back when I served previously in the Congress, and that is to start reducing taxes, dismantling many unfair taxes, unnecessary taxes, and I cannot imagine the circumstances under which there would be a need to talk about raising taxes or implementing new taxes, and my answer to that question is unqualified no.
Okay, thank you. I've got a couple questions for you, Bob. Have you ever had any license revoked or not renewed for cause, or been the subject of professional discipline or cited for breach of ethics or unprofessional conduct by any bar association, disciplinary committee, court, administrative agency, or other professional groups or have you been expelled from any organization? If so, please explain.
No, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. And are you currently connected to any outstanding unpaid taxes in any way?
No, ma'am.
Thank you. Okay, we can go on with number 12.
What is your stand on immigration, securing the border, and amnesty? And what is your plan on immigration reform?
Amnesty, unqualified, no. There's one path to citizenship, and it's the only path to citizenship, and that is the process laid out in our Constitution. These notions or these programs that they talk about in Washington, well, if you've been in this country for a certain number of years and you've been a good boy or a good boy or a good girl, you can have a path to citizenship. No way. The only path to citizenship is that which is laid out lawfully in our Constitution. The Constitution does provide, I think very clearly, that it is one of those enumerated, limited federal functions to protect our borders. And I have no problem at all using our military for that purpose. I'm not a fan of modifying posse comitatus and getting our military involved in all sorts of things, but protecting the border, sometimes that is necessary. Securing the border is essential. It's not a question of just throwing a bunch of money at it and saying, well, we're going to hire 50,000 new border agents. You have to do it smartly. You have to do it wisely, but it is an absolute function of the federal government and responsibility. Once you do that and you force people to come into this country only through lawful border crossings or lawful ports of entry, so that you start once again enforcing those laws, we need to also go back and modernize our visa and work permitting system. It makes no sense at all in the year 2014 to base our visa and work permitting system on the workforce needs of our country back in the 1980s. That makes no sense whatsoever. So on the one hand, we need to address the question of illegal immigration into this country and those who are already here, to get them to register so we know who they are. But we also have to be a lot smarter about reforming and modernizing our legal immigration system. It makes no sense to bring people into this country as students and then kick them out as soon as they have completed their education. We need them here. We need to know who they are. They need to register. They need to do it within the bounds of the law, but we need to modernize those.
Thank you.
Bob, what's your position on the supplemental nutrition assistance programs and to follow up drug testing to qualify for those programs?
I've never had any problem for people who want to qualify for federal assistance to ensure that they are not drug users, as well as to ensure that they are not felons and involved in other criminal activity. The program itself is far too large. As a matter of fact, I'm not really sure, Bill, that there's even a proper justification for it. So at a minimum, what we need to do with that, as well as the so-called food stamp program, is start cutting them back. And yet what we see in Washington, most recently in the agriculture bill that passed, that's now been signed into law, is an expansion of these programs. They're too big, there's too much fraud. When I was U.S. Attorney back in the late 1980s, we prosecuted numerous cases of food stamp fraud. Nowadays, even though they aren't physical stamps, but an electronic benefit transfer, we still see massive fraud. So instead of expanding these programs like SNAP and the food stamp program, we need to be cutting them back, and we also need to do a much better job of prosecuting fraud.
Thank you.
What is the unemployment rate in Georgia?
The unemployment rate varies a little bit. It's probably around, I think, around 7% now. You have to approach a lot of these news accounts of this with a little sense of humor, because there was a news account just the other day that the unemployment rate had inched up, but not as much as the experts thought it would go up. So, folks in Washington say, oh, isn't this great? One, it's not going up as fast as we expected it to, but there were actually some folks, and I watched some of them on the news with a straight face, that could say, this is good news, because it means that more people are looking for jobs. I mean, it's all nonsense. What isn't nonsense, though, is the fact that far too many people in our society want to work, but can't find jobs, and in many respects they can't find those jobs because the federal government is sopping up so much money in our society from businesses that ought to be using that money to hire people, to increase inventory. Instead, they're using their money to pay for regulations, they're paying for taxes, And there is so much uncertainty that they're not out there hiring and buying their inventory the way they ought to be.
Please describe the geographic boundaries of your district.
The 11th District of Georgia consists of Cherokee County in its entirety, Bartow County in its entirety, probably about 40% of Cobb County from the northwest down to the southeast corner, Kennesaw, Ackworth, Marietta, Dobbins, about half of Smyrna and Vinings. And then it tails off into Fulton County, where it includes a chunk of Buckhead and a little bit of Sandy Springs inside 285.
For solutions to traffic and other infrastructure issues, do you support the regional approach, such as the Atlanta Regional Commission, or another method of dealing with these issues?
I don't support some regional government body deciding how people in Cherokee County or any other county or municipality get from point A to point B. That ought to be up to the citizens, the voters, the taxpayers in that county, not some amorphous regional government. I know that sounds good, you know, regionalism and so forth, but I don't support that. The general approach that I support is to stop taking so much money from our citizens and our businesses by way of gasoline taxes, for example, and then doling it back out to the states according to what some unelected bureaucrats in Washington decide is an appropriate method to do that. Stop taxing people so much in the first place, leave that money in with the individuals and in the states, and also in the meantime, until we can sort of wean people off, the federal government off of those transportation gas dollars, we ought to move the location of the decision-making from Washington back to the states.
Bob, what do you think that the federal government's role should be in regards to alternative energy sources and subsidies?
To, first of all, get out of the way and stop standing in the way of any energy source. I mean, we have in this country more than adequate energy resources, whether it's natural gas, whether it's petroleum, whatever, to more than meet our needs into the foreseeable future. Yet the folks in Washington constantly run around like chicken littles with their heads cut off. I know that kind of mixes metaphors. You know, wringing their hands, saying, "Oh, woe is us. We have to, pay attention to the environment. We can't allow fracking. We can't allow the XL Keystone pipeline." Nonsense. What we ought to do is get EPA out of the business of stopping the development of energy in this country. Get the federal government out of it. Let companies go in and take the resources where they find them, such as in Canada, build the pipeline. There's absolutely no reason not to do that, Bill. We've had the Alaska pipeline now for 2 generations, and there has never been a spill or a significant breach of that pipeline, despite all of the tree huggers worrying about it, back in the 1960s and 70s when it was being planned and implemented. We need to take a lesson from that. We need to get the government out of it, stop playing favorites like whether it's Celinda or Tesla or whatever.
Excellent, thank you.
What's the difference between a republic and a democracy?
A democracy, which our founders studied and did not specifically implement in our country, where you have a direct relationship between the people and the government, they do it through a republic. We have a representative democracy. We have a democratic process that is free and open, hopefully free and hopefully open elections, as you see in a democracy. But in America, at the federal level, we elect representatives to govern. So, you have, as our framers, I think, properly envisioned, that is not only a much more efficient way, but also a way to ensure the national interests and the state interests are more properly represented.
Susan, thank you.
Bob, overall, do you think free trade with other countries helps or hurts the U.S. economy?
Generally speaking, if it is truly free trade, and that means free on both sides of the equation, it helps us. It opens up markets. It creates jobs in this country. The problem that we've frequently had, and I had to deal with this when I was in the Congress previously with NAFTA, for example, is we will either engage in trade negotiations and set up trade agreements with other countries that allow them to to place limits or keep limits in place that limit our access, our company's access to their markets, or it places limits on both. What we need is to make sure that we maintain a level playing field. And where you have foreign markets, such as the Chinese markets, we have a huge trade imbalance with China. They're our greatest predator nation, which raises a host of other questions, perhaps. But we ought not to ever be afraid to say, okay, this is a proper role for the federal government. To the Chinese government or any other government that imposes impediments or barriers to our access to their markets, and they can do it both directly and indirectly, that, okay, if you're going to do that, then you're not going to have free access to our markets for your goods. It's got to be a truly level playing field, and that is a proper role for the federal government in international trade.
Thank you.
Should candidates for public office be required to release their tax records?
No. What they ought to be required to do, for example, in federal elections, is to file those papers that are required by federal law to indicate broad categories of income, to ensure that if there are any conflicts there, that people know about them. That sort of transparency, I think, is very important, but I wouldn't be in favor of federal law or state law even that requires an individual to open up their income tax records. By the way, I'd like to get rid of the IRS.
Bob, what would you do to raise the approval rating of Congress?
It's very interesting, Bill, because we need to do that. It's not good for the country to have the Congress of the United States, which represents through the House and through the Senate, all of us in this country, have approval ratings that are barely breaking into double digits. I mean, that is not good for America. It's interesting, though, during the years that I had served previously in the Congress, when we actually were reducing the debt and balanced the budget, we had some of the highest approval ratings for Congress in generations. So Congress's approval ratings were going like this as the national debt was going down. In other words, the lesson there is, if Congress will do the right thing, people will support it. So what I intend to do is to, when I am once again a representative in the House of Representatives, is to work to balance the budget, work to reduce government spending, work to reduce regulations, all of those things that we did before, and the people will respond. That's what we need to do to raise Congress's approval ratings. Do the right thing.
Okay, I apologize just for a second. We're going to change a little bit. The printing did not come out on our sheets correctly, so I'm going to have Trenton read some of these questions directly from our list because
Sure.
they were not printed correctly, and I apologize for the interruption. Trenton?
Okay. There are a number of issues the agriculture industry is facing in Georgia, including water use, federal regulation compliance, tax reform, immigration reform. What is your plan to address these issues for the agricultural community and District 11?
When I served in the Congress previously, I was the primary sponsor of something called the Tri-State Water Compact. As probably all of us here, and probably most of the members of the Cherokee Republican Party know, states cannot engage in a compact, that is agreements between the states, without congressional approval. So when we face the issue of the so-called water wars, or the amount of water from what is called the ACT River Water Basin in Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, ACT and ACF, we decided that the best way to be able to handle that would be for the three states to be able to set up a compact and reach agreement, a regional agreement. So we passed through the Congress the Tri-State Water Agreement. Unfortunately, partisan politics among the three states really sort of undercut that process. So it became a decades-long process of trying to get the three states to agree, because it's very important to particularly our agricultural interests. That's the Chattahoochee River Basin is primarily used by Georgia for drinking water and for agriculture. So we finally wound up in the federal courts, unfortunately. We had a federal judge that ruled against us. Thankfully, the Court of Appeals ruled for us and enabled Georgia to continue to take water from, for example, Lake Lanier, Lake Allatoona, to quench people's thirst and keep our economy going. We have to do everything we can here in Georgia and through our congressional delegation to make sure that we are no longer held hostage by particular parochial economic interests in Florida or Alabama to undercut that process that we work so hard to accomplish. That is very, very important for agriculture in our state.
What is your opinion on the Department of Education?
Don't like it, never have. Worked to try and defund it when I was in the Congress previously. We obviously weren't successful. It's still there. It's bigger than ever. But we need to try and continue to dismantle it, to defund it. Educating our children should have properly nothing whatsoever to do with a bunch of federal bureaucrats in Washington. It should be the responsibility first and foremost of parents, secondly of local school boards and local government, and only tangentially the state. But there is no legitimate federal interest in educating our children whatsoever, and I think we need to get rid of it.
Do you support the fair tax or other consumption tax or some other alternative?
Bottom line is I support anything that will reduce the cost, the scope, the power of the IRS. And that means if in fact we were able to get through the Congress a truly flat tax, I would be right out in front as one of its great cheerleaders and support that. My preference of all of the different meaningful tax reform proposals that are out there or that have ever been made is a fair tax, a national consumption tax, because to me it is without a doubt the fairest form of tax. You pay as much tax as you want to through your spending habits. I'm not sure that the different proposals out there, HR 2525, which I supported previously when I was in the House, is good. It's not perfect, but of all of the proposals, I do believe that the fair tax is the best.
What do you plan to do for District 11?
What I plan to do for District 11 is what I did for the old 7th District, and that is to be a voice for the Constitution, a voice for cutting back the size, the scope, the cost, and the power of the federal government and returning all of those elements to the people of the 11th District. And to do that in a number of ways through my service on what I plan to do, and that is once again serve on the Judiciary Committee and the Financial Services and the Government Reform and Oversight Committees, but also to hold, as I always did when I was previously in the Congress, numerous constant town hall meetings of the district to be available so that people know who their representative is. There's never a doubt that Bob Barr was very close to the people of the 7th District. I intend to do the same for the people of the 11th District, and also to make sure that I am a strong voice and a ready backbone to stand up for their interests, to stand up to Washington, and to stand up to the establishment.
Yes, there's 3 more.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Do you agree with the recent government shutdown?
First of all, of course, it wasn't a government shutdown. We ran into this same thing back in 1995 and 1996, doing in our budget battles with Bill Clinton. It wasn't then a government shutdown, and in 2013 it wasn't a government shutdown. There was a cutback in non-essential government services, which simply begs the question, why are we paying for these things in the first place if they're non-essential? But that aside, I do think that it was an important exercise. I did support it, and I was very disappointed, for example, just a couple of months ago when the Congress, with a lot of Republican support even, did away with the sequester, which even though it mandated very small cuts, it did mandate, and we were actually seeing cuts in government spending as a result of the sequester. They did away with that simply to get a budget through that would take them through the 2014 election, and now the cost of the federal budget is going up again, and we have these folks in Washington once again doing what they are so good at, and that is saying, aren't we great? We've slowed the rate of growth in government spending. That's what's killing us. That's that death by 1,000 cuts. We need to stop that.
How are you going to react to the heavy lobbying and manipulation by special interests and maintain the integrity of small government?
Same way I did before, and that is never to be swayed by anything other than 2 things: the Constitution of the United States of America and the best interests of my constituents. That is not to say that you don't listen to organizations that have an interest in Washington. I certainly listened to the NRA when I was in Washington, but that is not what controls my vote. It was not what controlled my vote before. My votes always were and always will be based on the best interests of my constituents and the Constitution of the United States, period.
Okay.
There's one more.
Okay.
As our representative, what are you going to do to prevent the president from continuing to trample the Constitution?
Very, very good question, because this has bothered me, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat in the White House. We have separation of powers. We have a government of defined responsibilities and duties. And if a president decides that by either a signing statement, he's not going to abide by a particular law that Congress has passed or part of it, or decides that he's going to issue an executive order, and many of those are issued in secret, which is even more unfortunate, then in the Congress, I will once again be a voice for the Congress to stand up for its proper role and responsibility and take steps to stop the president from doing that. And they can do it. They can challenge these in court. They can pass either limitations on appropriations bill, denying the president any funds to implement a particular executive order that Congress deems is unconstitutional, or they can do that, and if the president wants that spending bill, he's going to have to abide by it and agree to it. So there are things that can be done to stop that.
Thank you. Just to reassure you that the same questions are asked of each candidate that we interview, and just so you are reassured with that. I'm sorry about the differences here. Harry, would you like to pick up with the next question, please?
The USPS has continued to request relief from Congress and has continued to take on debt. Do you support providing relief for the Postal Service or some other means such as privatization?
What I favor with the U.S. Postal Service is to remove their legal monopoly that they have. They actually have the best of both worlds from their standpoint, the worst of all worlds for us. We pay for them, and we also have no control over them, no direct control. There's very little that Congress can do directly, but Congress can change the law and open up the delivery of postal products and so forth to the open market. That's the direction in which we need to be going.
Okay, what is your educational background, Bob?
I have a law degree from Georgetown University Law Center, a master's degree in international affairs from George Washington University, and a bachelor's degree from the University of Southern California, also in international relations.
Okay. Have you or has any organization of business under your control ever declared bankruptcy or been sued or currently facing liens or other financial issues?
No.
And I just already asked you that one, I think. Have you ever been arrested or convicted of any crime excluding minor traffic offenses?
No.
Okay. Next question, Jack. Can you pick that up?
32.
Yes.
Right. In what ways does foreign policymaking process resemble the domestic policymaking process?
Of course, both. Whether you're talking about the federal government involving itself internationally or domestically, it has to do those things within the bounds of the Constitution. That being said, the president has, and the U.S. government has much broader authority and leeway in conducting foreign affairs, including military operations, diplomatic efforts, than the government does when it operates domestically. For example, internationally, our government doesn't have to, nor should it have to worry about the Fourth Amendment, for example, in conducting a search in military operations somewhere. If our government operates domestically, it definitely, whether it's, regardless of what agency it is, it has to abide by the Fourth Amendment, for example. So there are a lot more constraints domestically than in the conduct of foreign affairs. And a president does have leeway there. But a president should not ever have leeway to violate federal law simply because he says, oh, I'm doing it internationally. The NSA spying being the best example.
What are the United States elements of national power and explain their importance?
Our national power rests first and foremost in the heart of every American citizen. It is the strength of our commitment to freedom here and around the world that always has been ultimately the source of our victories in the world. Military might is very, very important, and we ought not to be engaged in cutting that back at this time. Our economic might certainly is also a very, very important part of our national power and our international power. But ultimately, if we as a people don't remain true to our concept of freedom, individual liberty, and individual responsibility at home, then it's really not going to matter very much how strong a military we have, how strong our economy is, what resources we export abroad. We have to maintain that strong commitment to freedom here at home so that we remain strong abroad.
Thank you, Bob.
What is the military-industrial complex, and how does it factor into foreign policy?
I know probably that term I think was first used by President Eisenhower, the military-industrial complex. I think basically what he was getting at, and I think he was right, we have to be very careful as a nation, despite the fact that we are free market oriented, or at least used to be, that we do support and understand the role of business and that we encourage business and ought to make our country a target for businesses rather than keeping them out, bringing them in and encouraging it. We have to be mindful of too close a relationship between big business, so to speak, and the government. For example, the government is prohibited technically from engaging in gathering certain information on people. We have something called the Privacy Act that guards against that. Yet what we've seen several times in recent years is a way for the government to circumvent the Privacy Act by going to a company and saying, we'll pay you to do what we can't do directly, and then you just share that information with us. We have to be very, very careful of that.
Bob, what do you see as being the current largest threat to our country's geopolitical interests?
The absolute fiscal irresponsibility of our government. That harms us in every conceivable way domestically, but it also is having a very serious limiting effect on our ability to affect our national interests abroad. When you are a creditor nation, particularly a creditor nation to a very, very powerful and constantly potential adversary like Communist China, that dramatically limits what you can do in the world. And we've seen this with other nations. The British government, after World War II, was very much a debtor nation. And that gave rise to, I'm not saying that I support the British Empire or colonies, but it severely limited their ability to protect their interests, their economic interests around the world, and they basically just shrunk back to what they are now, and that is just a small island nation. Nice people, but that was largely the direct result of a very strong downturn in their economy becoming a creditor nation. Being a creditor nation limits our ability to project and protect our interests around the world.
What do you see as being the current largest threat to domestic security?
The same as the largest single threat to our geopolitical posture, and that is our fiscal irresponsibility. We simply cannot continue down the road year after year after year of racking up what I think last year was $1 trillion deficit. This year, Washington, pats themselves on the back because it might only be $700 billion. Not $1 trillion. That's good. We're mortgaging our future. We're mortgaging the future of our children and grandchildren, and we're severely limiting our ability, the ability of our economy and businesses to make up our economy to get us out of the recession that we were in for several years.
Thank you, Bob. Just a couple more questions and then we'll be completed. As this committee, we want to give you every opportunity to get out information that you feel the voters would be interested in. So this is your opportunity, basically. Is there anything else we should know that has not already been addressed about you as a candidate for this position?
Barr is a very nice guy. No, listen, I pray you, we've covered a lot of ground here in a very short period of time. My background, my views on domestic and international affairs and the Constitution. These are very much the issues that I've worked on before in the Congress. They are the issues that I will continue to work on in the Congress. I don't believe that we accomplish great things as a nation by playing defense. And I do not intend to play defense in Washington. I think we ought to be much more, not just proactive, but aggressive in moving our agenda forward, domestically and internationally, and that's what I intend to do.
Well, thank you very much for being here today. We greatly appreciate it. I know the voters will be better informed after they watch this video and make really informed decisions now, because as we all know, a candidate can't reach into every home, every kitchen table, so it's really important that we offer this opportunity. It's important to us as committee members, it's important to us as the Republican Party, and we thank you for your participation and accepting the invitation.
I enjoyed it and look forward to it again. Thank you all.
Thank you.